I have a friend. His name is Chris Padone. He used to run our parking lot outside. And one day, this was years ago, one day we were hanging out outside, we're about to play basketball, and he has this brown paper bag. He reaches inside the paper bag, he pulls out this sandwich. And it's peanut butter and Nutella. And he takes a big bite of it, and he looks at me with a mouthful of this sandwich, and he goes, "I call this a sticky situation." I thought that was brilliant. But that's not what our series is about at all. But that's what I think of when I think of sticky situations. We're talking about something totally different. You're gonna try that. Just watch. Peanut butter and Nutella. Just have something to moisten the situation. Okay, so think about this for real. What comes to mind, really, when you picture peace? Peace. If you had to paint a picture of peace, what would you paint? If you had to think up a picture of peace, what would you think up? If you had to describe peace, how would you describe it? For me, I've told some of you before, when you open a fresh jar of peanut butter and the top is totally smooth, untouched, that's peace. Right? Or maybe you look at the snow, right? Saturday, you look at the backyard, front yard, the road even, undisturbed peace. No paw prints, nothing. Maybe for you it's like the beach. Maybe it's like when the water is smooth out on the lake, right? Undisturbed peace. Or internal peace. What do you think of internal peace? No worries, no fears, no anxiety, doubts, right? Just internal peace. Or maybe even people peace. Like when you have peace with people. What do you think of? How do you describe that? No fighting, no issues, no arguing, right? What I'm getting at here is that for a lot of us, when we think of peace, we're thinking about the absence of something. There's no worries, there's no fear, there's no anxiety, there's no footprints in the snow, there's no disturbance, there's no finger in the peanut butter, there's no conflict, there's no confrontation. We think of the absence of something. But in the world that Jesus lived in, peace was actually not the absence of something, or it wasn't just the absence of something, it was the presence of something else. It wasn't just neutral. Like when we think of peace, we just think really neutral. Peace in the ancient world was a positive thing. It was describing what was there, not what wasn't there. So think of it like this. In the ancient world, if there were two nations that were enemies and they were fighting, when they stopped fighting, that wasn't considered peace. It wasn't peace, the word they used was shalom. It wasn't peace unless the two nations had started working together for each other's good. In other words, it's a positive, it's not just neutral, right? And so if you're thinking about your neighbor next door, and if you were to say, do we have peace? Well, in our culture, in our world, we say, well, we're not fighting, so yeah, there's peace there. But really, it wouldn't be peace unless there is this, garden in between the two of you, and you both maintain it, and it's mutually beneficial. Peace is a positive thing when it comes to specifically peace with other people, right? They also use the word peace to describe wholeness, like things being totally complete, perfect almost. Like if there was a big block or a stone they were using to build some kind of structure, if it was totally free of cracks and imperfection, it was said to have shalom. So it was a really positive thing. And in between, with people, it was this attractive chemistry that made both sides better. So if we're talking about it today, we're going to use the word shalom like they would. We would say that, or maybe not today, but maybe in the 90s, we would say that Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen had shalom, right? They made each other better. If you don't know who that is, they're basketball players, but come on. Joanna and Chip and Joanna Gaines, They've got shalom. They've got peace in that sense. They are better together than they are apart. The Power Rangers, the Paw Patrol, Regis and Kathy Lee, right? You get the idea? Like, you're better together than they are. That's a picture of peace. It's attractive. It's something that people wanted. For me, before I understood it that way, peace was just kind of like, all right, I guess it's not fighting. Sure, we have peace. There's no issues. But it's so much better than that. Now, with that idea, Jesus described the church as a place of peace. And some of the followers after Jesus said, like, peace, do everything you can to keep this bond of peace. The church was supposed to be this place where all the different parts come together and make this body, this whole, that's stronger together than they are apart. There's supposed to be this incredible chemistry in the church. Now, maybe you've seen this before. Maybe you've seen this at other churches, or maybe you've even seen this here at this church. Like, if you've seen our team, there is this sense of peace, like this chemistry among different parts of the team. We had a start party a little while ago. Maybe you remember me talking about it, but it was a party. We had tacos from Swell Taco. It was for people who were looking for a place to start. And there was a team there that was running the party. And there came a point, we had more people than we thought we were going to have. And so the line like just went down the hallway and started to get toward the door. And it was at night and it was cold. And so I looked down the hallway and I see all these people waiting in line to get tacos. And I start feeling like, oh no, this might go wrong. I don't want people to have a bad experience. I hope this doesn't backfire. And I get all the ideas and all the oh no's. And so I walk back into the room and I look at one of our team members and I'm like, I'm a little concerned about the line, you know? And she looks at me and she goes, I got this. And within 1 minute, there were about 5 or 6 ladies going down the hall with trays and cans of drinks, passing them out like we were the Ritz-Carlton, you know? Someone else was passing out stickers and little tchotchkes they found in some back closet, and these kids are smiling. And I looked at them and I was like amazed. That is the picture of shalom, like these people working together, and it's something beautiful. And so when we see it in life, in the workplace, in our families, it's an amazing thing when one part works to help the other part. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing. The problem, though, with peace is that it involves people, you know? And people have issues, including myself. We step on each other's toes. And maybe you've been part of this before, where you meet some people, or you're part of a new thing, or a new group, or a new workplace, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. Or a new relationship, like, wow, he's amazing, she's amazing. And then it's like, oh, but they do this thing, you know, and the peace is disrupted. Something's off. It's different. You know, maybe at one point you and your mother-in-law were like, you know, firing on all cylinders and it was great and you were making each other better and she was happy watching your kids and everything. And then all of a sudden starts, you know, giving them shots of whiskey, you know, and it's like, whoa. Well, now what do we do? People disturb peace. And if you're in a group or a relationship or something and there's no problems, wait, because there will be. And seriously, if you're part of this church and you're taking steps toward like deeper involvement, whether it's in a group or on the team, you are, I hope you're gonna have like a great experience at first, but then something's gonna happen. And I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to involve people or a person or something. And it's going to disrupt that magical feeling because that's the nature of the human race. And so what do you do when someone disturbs your peace? Do you let it destroy the relationship or damage the relationship? I mean, seriously, this is a real question. What do you tend to do when all of a sudden that brick that was perfect gets a crack in it? I worked with some people early on, about 11 years ago. When I first started working in a church, I was an intern, and I worked at a church that was going through an intense season of conflict. And the person that was my boss was in charge of this conflict resolution organization. His name's Jim Van Yper and his wife Sharon Van Yper. They worked together. And what they taught me during that time, I was just getting into all of this. And right away, I was like on a crash course of conflict resolution. And I hated it because I realized how much I hated conflict. I ran from conflict. I want to have the tough conversation. But the things I learned there still, and the things I'm continuing to learn about conflict still are doing wonders, not just for my relationships in church, but for my own personal relationships. And I think if we'll take a good, hard look at conflict and how to handle it, sticky situations, there's so much we can walk away with when it comes to our relationships and our workplaces and our families. And so Jesus, like knowing the nature of the human race, he did talk about peace, but he also gave some really practical ways of getting back to peace and of handling conflict. And here's what he says. He tells this story. It's in Matthew chapter 5. It's recorded by a guy named Matthew in the 5th chapter. Here's what he says, okay? Jesus sets up this hypothetical situation, and this is one of those situations that's a little bit hard for us to grasp because of the disconnect in our cultures. But here we go. He says, if you're offering your gift at the altar. Now, this situation here, a gift at the altar. Maybe you think church, maybe you think the up front of a church, maybe you think a food donation or clothes or whatever. And all those things are good, but probably what comes to your mind when he says a gift at the altar is not what comes to everyone else's mind that he was speaking to back then. Their altar was in the city of Jerusalem. It was at the temple in Jerusalem, which was like the one place. It was like the holy place on earth, the holiest, most religious, revered, sacred place. And if you were going to offer a gift at that altar, that was a big deal. Like you would remember that forever. It was a huge hassle. It's possible you would have taken days traveling just to get there to offer your gift. Your gift would have been like a serious sacrifice, something that would have cost you a lot, and you may have taken literally days to get there to perform this religious act of worship. Then once you get there, likely you'd be online for hours waiting to get to the front, all right? Now, this might seem unrelated, but follow me here. So here you are, you're like, it is finally my turn. You turn behind you, the line behind you is like Disney World. It's going on forever. You've been waiting for weeks to get to this point. You're like, I'm about to do my thing, right? And you're about to engage in this gift at the altar. And Jesus says, so if you're doing this, and there you remember that your brother or sister, someone in your community of faith, has something against you, he says, leave your gift there in front of the altar. Drop it. Drop it. He says, first, go and be reconciled to them. Fix it. And then come and offer your gift. This would have been laughable. Like, it is ridiculously impractical. It's like him saying, if you take a road trip to Florida, all right, and you get there and you realize you've got beef with someone in your family, just stop what you're doing and go back and then come back. It would be like, what? No way. This is the most sacred thing somebody could be doing at that time in that place. And so what Jesus is saying really here is that this stuff matters. He's not saying if you get to the front of the line there and you remember, like, oh, just take out your reminders app and ask Siri to remind you when you get back home. He's not saying put it at the top of your to-do list. He doesn't say prioritize it, like really try not to forget. He says stop everything and fix it if they have something against you. It's a priority. And so for me, the language I need to hear, like in really digesting this, what he's saying here with the issues you run into, with the little things, the little like stepping on each other's toes, whether it's at home with your spouse or your significant other or in the workplace or in a church or whatever, something happens. What Jesus would say here is, it's not fine. It's not fine. If you're like me and something happens, it's fine. It's fine. It'll blow over. What he's saying is, it won't blow over. If we're talking about getting back to peace, this like chemistry, this kind of stuff, we like to pretend it doesn't really affect the relationship, but it does. It's fine until it's not fine. And maybe you hold it in and hold it in and hold it in, and there's that thing and there's that little thing and this little thing and that thing, and then boom, it explodes. Now it's a big deal. Or maybe maybe you're not the explosive type, but maybe you were like super tight here. But with every little offense, the distance got bigger and bigger, and now things just aren't the same anymore. But really, these things can be traced back to these little things that piled up and became a problem that were never addressed because it was fine. It was fine. Not a big deal. I was working at a restaurant when I was in college, and there was a waiter that I worked for. He was the waiter, I was the busboy, so he got all the tips and I did all the hard work. And I'm just kidding, a little. And so what he would do is, like, he was this older guy and he was nice for the most part, but he would give me his order. So he'd like go out to the table, he'd come back and say, okay, I need 2 balsamic dressings, I need a Caesar salad, I need this. And he would give it to me, and I worked hard and I would go get it for him as fast as I could. But he would like bark at me, like just throw these orders at me. And eventually it was like getting under my skin, but it was fine. So I didn't say anything. And eventually I'm like, you know what? How can I just really do the right thing here and just be the best person I can be? So let me try even harder. And maybe then the guy will show me a little bit of respect. So what I started to do is he'd be like, all right, I need this, I need that. And I'd work as hard as I can to get it to him as fast as I can. So I'd literally start to walk away. And I'd be like, all right, so 2 balsamics, 1 Caesar salad, a honey mustard. And he'd like yell at me as I'm walking away. And then I'd go get his things and bring them back to him. And I'd do it over and over again. And it wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. And I got to the point I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to be around him. I felt disrespected, like unappreciated, horrible. One day, he's giving me his order, and I'm like, okay, and I'm doing this, and he just drops everything, and he goes, will you stop walking away from me and show me a little bit of respect? And I was like, me? Show you respect? And boom. I'm trying to show him as much respect as I can, and he's receiving everything I'm doing as disrespect. And it wasn't fine, but it was. Like every step, for him, me walking away was fine, it was fine. It was, instead of saying like, hey, hold on just a second, stop and listen to me. Right? And me, instead of being like, hey, do you have to like scream at me? Instead of just saying the hard thing, both of us just swept it under the rug until boom. And maybe this has happened to you in your relationships, and maybe it wasn't a boom. Maybe it was a disappearance. Like they're gone. They didn't explode, they just left because they were done. And maybe it came back to these little things, and maybe it was all because really it was fine. But it wasn't. And so now it's not a relationship anymore. And so Jesus would say, go be reconciled to them if you think they have something against you. So then he goes into this other passage, right? And this is a little bit later. And it's more of a process. And I'm going to warn you, you're going to have to buckle up a little bit because this is pretty intense. But he gives some actual steps, a real process. Like, okay, here's how you handle it. And here's what he says. You ready? I'll read the whole thing. Then we can reflect together. He says, if your brother or sister, all right, this person in the community of faith, if they sin against you, he says, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over, right? There's the motive, to win them over. So if they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He's quoting from their Bible, right? Like backing up what he's saying. And then he goes, all right, so he says, address them directly, and then bring 1 or 2 other people. But if they still refuse to listen, ready, here we go. He says, tell it to the church. Which reminds me, this morning, as Tom, the other pastor here, as he was walking in, he stubbed his toe, and he said a dirty word. And if they refuse to listen, even to the church, here we go, he says, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. This is Jesus. So let's summarize, okay? Here we go. He says, 1, call them out. 2, gang up on them. 3, shame them. 4, cancel them. If you were here with us last week, we talked about Jesus and correcting other people. He's like, wipe the speck out of their eye, you know? Like, it's like this very gentle, if you remember. Like, what happened to gentle Jesus in this wiping the speck out of your eye? The answer is that was in Matthew chapter 5. This is Matthew chapter 18, so he's fed up at this point. So what's the idea here? Like, what is he saying? And really, this is a helpful thing. We can take this off. This is a helpful thing. Whenever you come up, like you run into a passage where Jesus says something and you're like, well, that doesn't sound like the Jesus that we talk about, dig a little bit deeper, because sometimes there are barriers in the way of interpreting the passage like the accurate way. There's something that's happening here that doesn't hit the original audience the way that it hits us. So what Jesus is saying here first is pretty clear. First, he says, if there's an issue, if someone sins against you, he says, go to them. Appeal to the person. Appeal to the person. Tell them what the issue is. This isn't a hard thing, but it's a pretty clear thing. And so what's interesting is if you were following along with the last passage, the last one was, if they have something against you, go to them. In this one, he says, if you have something against them, go to them. In other words, if there's an issue between you and someone else, if someone's offended and someone else has done the offending, whose job is it to do the confrontation, to initiate the conversation? The answer is, it's yours. It's your job, no matter what side you're on. And so he says, first, go to the person and just share with them what happened. Now, what's important here is recognizing the motive. He says if they've listened, you've won them over. This is not to put them in their place. It's not to attack them. It's to restore peace. Just make it clear there's a crack in that brick that needs to be repaired. And so you go and you tell them. He says, secondly, if they don't listen, bring someone else along. Appeal to their perspective. He says, bring along 1 or 2 other people. You're not ganging up on them. If the goal is to restore peace, the idea is bring along someone who's not knee-deep in the emotions of this situation. Now, maybe this seems intense to you, but if you've ever been to a counselor, you've done this. You're going to someone else who might have something to contribute so that the 2 people can have, so that you and the other person can have peace. And so he says, bring in somebody else. And then here's the hairy part. He says, if they don't listen, tell the church. Now, in the ancient world, the church was not like this, right? It wasn't this gigantic organization with all these people. He's not saying make room for it in the welcome and announcements and share everybody's issues. The churches were much smaller, they were much tighter communities, and the idea here that he's getting at is to appeal to your shared principles. Assuming that the 2 of you have the same beliefs, go a layer deeper and address those beliefs that are informing the behavior. And then the next step makes perfect sense. He says, if they don't listen, if you've addressed the principles you're both supposedly operating under, if you're addressing the beliefs supposedly you both believe, and they don't listen to you, then he says, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. You and I hear that, and it's like, whoa. But there's no emotion behind those terms when Jesus said them. They're not insults. The word pagan was used to describe someone who didn't believe what that community of faith believed. And so he's saying here, like, you need to recalibrate, rethink your approach. Why? Because you thought you were operating under shared beliefs, but maybe you're not. Does it mean cancel them and shut them out? No. Does it mean shun them? No. Does it mean shame them? No. What it does mean is if the Apostle Paul said later on, do everything you can to live at peace with everybody, what it means is that you addressing the belief that the two of you don't share is not going to get you there. So you need to rethink your approach. All right, so think about it like this. Imagine you're watching my dog, and you and I both know Jesus said all dogs need to eat 3 times a day. Now, he didn't say that. Maybe he did, but it's not recorded, all right? So let's say Jesus said dogs need to eat 3 times a day. Now, you don't feed my dog 3 times a day. You're doing twice a day. And so I go to you and I'm like, hey, my dog's gotta eat 3 times a day. And you're like, yeah, whatever. And then I go through the whole process. I bring along my dog friend expert and I'm like, hey, remember he's saying like dog's gotta eat 3 times a day? And you're like, no. And then eventually, right, so we've gotten the perspective. We address the principle, the shared beliefs. Okay, don't we both believe that Jesus said dogs need to eat 3 times a day? And if you say, nah, I don't believe that. Okay, well then, that no longer carries any weight. So I need to rethink my approach because we're not operating on the same ground. If there's gonna be peace, it's not gonna come from that way. It's not gonna come from a shared belief because the belief isn't shared. Now, I want to explain that to you, not because you're gonna go that far in the process, probably most of the time, but because Jesus said that, and when you run into that passage, I don't want you to be afraid of it. However, I would argue that 90, maybe even 95% of all of our issues can be handled in step 1. Go to the person. Go to them. If we'll learn how to do this, it can change our relationships and the way that we react to peace being disturbed in the relationship, to being offended and offending in relationships. But we need to develop the skills to do this. So if there's 2 things you're going to leave with here today, 1, it's that it's not fine to just sweep it under the rug. But 2, go to them. When there's an issue, go to them. If there's a problem, go to them. My friend told me a story, it's a true story. He was in New York City and he's just watching this unfold before him. He sees this guy who gets to a crosswalk, steps out into the street, begins to walk. I don't know if it was red or green, but he crosses the street. All of a sudden, a taxi cab comes flying, slams on the brake, and almost hits him, right? So the guy looks at the taxi cab driver, starts screaming at him. Taxi cab driver opens the door, gets out, starts screaming at the guy. They're going back and forth. It's conflict, and it's hot. And they're just screaming and name calling and all that stuff. All of a sudden, the guy in the crosswalk goes, hey, wait a minute. Is there anyone in your cab? And the cab driver goes, no. You need a ride? And he goes, yeah, can you take me? And he goes, all right, hop in. And all of a sudden, they get in, and they drive away into the sunset. And everything was great. A lot of us, when we think about conflict, that's where we go. All right, if I'm gonna address this, well then I gotta be ready to rumble. I gotta get ready to scream and yell and fight and name call and hurt and be hurt and maybe peace will just fall out of the sky. But it doesn't work that way. And if there's one thing that I walked away from, in my experience of conflict resolution 11 years ago, it's that conflict doesn't have to be so hot and emotionally charged. If you'll go in honestly, there are ways to navigate it. And so lastly, just in the time we have left, I want to give you 7 steps. Now, A lot of these steps came from a book called Crucial Conversations. We'll link that book on our app. We'll put it in the YouTube description. I've got 7 steps for you. Not all of them came from there, but a bunch of them did. You can write these down, or you can find them someplace. We'll put them on our website. We'll make them available. But these 7 steps, all right, for engaging, for going to the person can change your marriage, your relationships at work, your relationships at home, your friendships. Here we go, okay? Conflict. Step 1. Before you engage with someone, check your motive. Are you going into the conversation trying to restore peace genuinely? Or are you going in to put them in their place, to hurt back, to make a point, to be right? Is it genuinely to heal the relationship? I don't know about you, but for me, often it's not. I'm going in because I got something to say. And so first, check, why are you looking for a win-win? Or are you going in for some other reason? Secondly, master your story. Every time you go through something, every time there's some kind of offense, every time there's some kind of issue, there's a story that comes with that. And the story is, like what's happening is your interpretation of what's happening. And so if I'm making dinner for you and 4 nights this week, you don't show up when you say you're going to, I can't help but assign motives to your action. There's a story I'm telling myself. And that story might be they can never be trusted to show up on time. The story might be they don't value me, they don't appreciate me, they don't care about this. There's a story that's being told in my head. And it's so important that we're real and honest about the story that we're telling. Okay, how am I really interpreting this? What's going on within me? From there, this is the hard part. Share your story. This is where you have the confrontation. And here, you want to stick to facts and then share your feelings, your honest feelings, which takes courage because you have to be vulnerable. But you say, we agreed you were going to show up at 6 o'clock. You didn't. That's a fact. My feelings in this situation are unappreciated. I feel like you don't value what I'm doing. And then I share, not accuse, but this is how this is being received on my end. And then you ask to hear their story. Listen, you might find out you were wrong. Maybe you'll get an honest confession like, hey, you're right. I haven't given enough thought to the amount of time you spent working to get dinner ready. My bad. Or maybe you'll find out, no, there's this huge deal we've had to close and I'm leaving it undone every single day just so I'm not that late. You might find out something you didn't know. But you have to be open, be real about what you think the motive is, and be open to hearing what it actually may be. From there, you take responsibility. Most conflicts are not 100% fault on one side and 0% fault on the other side. It's usually split somewhere. Sometimes it's down the middle. A lot of times it's not. Even if you're 5% wrong and they're 95% wrong, your willingness to own that 5%, you'd be surprised how often it leads to them being willing to own the other 95%. But that 5%, or whatever percent it is of yours, that's the part you can do something about. And so own it. Take responsibility. And then ask for what you really want. Ask for what you really want. This is something in my relationship with my wife, this is something she's very good at. There'll be times we'll be going back and forth and she'll just stop and say, I need to know that you understand how that made me feel. I don't need you to fix it. I don't need you to do this. I just need to know you understand how that made me feel. And it's like, okay, well, that's the way forward. Now I know what to do. If you're not real, and this requires vulnerability, if you're not real about what you really want, you will not leave the conflict satisfied, and there will not be reconciliation. If you ask for someone to admit that they lied, but you really want to know that they actually respect you, when they say, I'm sorry, I lied, you're not going to feel like there's peace. And so you have to say, look, honestly, at the end of the day, I just feel like you haven't shown me any respect here. And give them a chance to fix it. But you have to ask for what you really want. And then lastly, you move to action. And this is where you put the plan into action. Okay, well, now that we've found out what's going on between us, here's what we're going to do to move forward. Here's some steps we could take to make sure this doesn't happen again. But it requires courage. It's hard. It's hard. It's easier to just say, it's fine. And maybe you're the kind of person that's comfortable in conflict and like ready to go in there. You don't need courage to engage in conflict. If that's you, I would argue you probably do need courage to admit where your feelings are hurt, even if you're willing to start the conversation. It's not easy to go there and be vulnerable. But this is the kind of stuff that literally has the potential to save your marriage. It has the potential to rescue broken relationships, to heal families, to save relationships between parents and kids, grown-up kids and grown-up parents. But we have to be willing to do it. We're out of time, but the idea that I want to leave you with is like just that people are worth it. The reality of my job requires me to be with a lot of people who are experiencing loss and grief. And grief is not fun, but the only thing worse than grief is like grief with regret. And this is where you hear a lot of regret. When people never had the hard conversation. They never shared how they really felt. They never explained what was really going on within them, and now it's over. There's no chance to restore peace. The people in your life are worth the courage that it takes to have these conversations. It's not easy. You have to be the brave one to venture out into the world of vulnerability and conflict. But if you're willing to do it, it literally can change your relationships and can change the rest of your life. So be the brave one, because people are worth it.